So, before we start, I have to say, this isn't one of those I heard a weird noise and got freaked out kind of stories. No, this is something way weirder. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about being alone at home. And trust me, when I say I was home alone, I mean really alone. Like no one should have been there except someone was. So, I've always been the type to enjoy being home alone. I mean, who doesn't? No parents, no rules. You can binge whatever you want, and you're free to do whatever. That's basically how I felt when my parents went on a weekend trip to visit my aunt. They left on Friday afternoon, and I had the whole place to myself until Sunday evening. Perfect, right? At first, everything was great. I spent the first few hours just chilling, watched a few episodes of The Office on Netflix, ordered some pizza. Pretty normal evening. It was around 10 p.m. when I decided to go to bed. I was feeling pretty tired, but I did one last thing before crashing. Locked the door, turned off the lights, and got into bed. I live in a house on the edge of the suburbs, so it's pretty quiet at night. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person alive, you know? Anyway, the first weird thing happened around midnight. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not like a random creak in the house or something you'd hear from the wind. This was distinct. You know that feeling when someone is walking around, but they're trying to be quiet about it? The soft thump of shoes on the hardwood floor? Yeah, that. Now, my immediate thought was, okay, maybe it's my parents. They came home early, whatever. But then I remembered. Nope, they weren't supposed to be back until Sunday evening. My brain tried to dismiss it as a car passing by, but the sound was way too close. Like, the footsteps were coming from somewhere inside the house. I could hear them getting closer, like they were moving down the hallway toward my room. My heart started racing. I was frozen in place, staring at the shadows in my room. I mean, I had locked every door. The windows were shut. Nobody else was supposed to be here. I held my breath, trying to listen harder, but the footsteps stopped suddenly. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and I just laid there, terrified. For a long time, everything was dead silent. No footsteps, no noise, just the sound of my own heartbeat in my chest. But then I heard something else, a whisper. It wasn't clear, just a faint sound at the edge of my hearing, like someone trying to speak from the other side of the room. I'm here. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was so quiet, but somehow, it felt so real. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I swear, I wasn't imagining it. I heard it, and it was coming from the hallway. I wanted to call the cops. I wanted to grab my phone, dial 911, and beg someone to come to get me, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that maybe it was just the wind or a loose pipe. But I knew deep down something was wrong. Really wrong. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the more I lay there in the dark, the more I felt like something or someone was out there just beyond my door. Eventually, I decided I had to check it out. I couldn't sit there in the dark forever, right? So, I quietly crept out of bed and grabbed a baseball bat that I kept under my dresser. Don't judge. Better safe than sorry. I tiptoed toward the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I slowly turned the knob, pushing the door open just a crack. The hallway was empty. The house was still. For a second, I felt a tiny bit of relief. But then, something caught my eye. There was a light on in the kitchen. I know for a fact I didn't leave that light on. I'm super OCD about turning off lights before I go to bed. My parents would literally disown me if I left the kitchen light on after 10 p.m. So, I knew someone had been in there. The only problem? There was no one in sight. I tiptoed down the hallway, each step making the floor creak under my weight. My hand was shaking as I gripped the bat. As I got closer to the kitchen, I noticed the door to the basement was wide open. That's when my stomach sank. The basement. I don't know what it is about basements. The whole idea of them freaks me out. It's like there's just something inherently wrong about being below ground in the dark. And there was no way I was going down there. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just leave the door open like that. I checked the kitchen first. No sign of anyone. Nothing was out of place, except for the fact that the back door, which I swear I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. At that point, I felt like I was losing my mind. I could still hear that voice, whispering, but now it was clearer. I'm still here. It felt like everything in my body was screaming at me to leave. But instead, I did the dumbest thing possible. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down the stairs into the basement. It was pitch black down there, so I flicked on the light. The basement wasn't huge, but it had a bunch of storage stuff, old boxes, tools, and a few random chairs stacked up in the corner. The air down there felt cold. Not just cold, unnaturally cold. And that's when I saw it. The thing that made my blood freeze. In the farthest corner of the basement, there was a figure standing perfectly still. It was just standing there, not moving, not making a sound, just a silhouette in the shadows. I could barely make out the outline, but it was tall, way too tall, and hunched forward. And then it spoke again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was clear. I'm in here with you. You're not alone. I dropped the flashlight. It hit the ground with a loud clatter. But when I turned back to look, the figure was gone. I ran out of there so fast, I'm pretty sure I left part of my soul behind. I bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. I didn't even bother checking the rest of the house. I just grabbed my phone, called my parents, and told them to come home early. I was done. They got back the next morning, and everything was fine. No sign of anyone breaking in. Nothing was missing, but I still don't know who or what I saw that night. And the worst part? After my parents came back, I started to feel like I wasn't alone again. It wasn't the same feeling as before. This time it was different. It was like something was watching me, following me. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm sitting in the dark, I hear that whisper again. It started out like any other Friday night. My roommates had all gone home for the weekend, and I had the house to myself for the first time in months. I was actually excited about it. No interruptions, no noise, no one eating the last of my snacks. Just me, the couch, and an endless Netflix queue. By 10:30 p.m., I was in full relaxation mode. Oversized hoodie, fuzzy socks, and a bowl of popcorn on my lap. I just started my second horror movie of the night. Because why not scare myself when I'm home alone, right? About halfway through the movie, I heard a noise. It was faint, almost like a knock. I paused the TV and held my breath listening. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from the living room window. At first, I brushed it off as the wind. It was a stormy night, and the branches outside had been swaying all evening. But then I remembered something that sent a chill through me. There were no trees near that window. I walked over, trying to act casual, but my heart was racing. I peeked out through the blinds. The streetlight outside was casting long shadows across the yard, but I didn't see anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to the couch. The movie was almost over when I heard it again. This time it wasn't tapping. It was footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from the hallway just behind me. I froze. My first thought was I locked the door, didn't I? But the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light sliced through the darkness as I moved toward the hallway. My palms were sweating and my breathing was shallow. When I reached the hallway, everything was still, silent, empty. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the fear. It's just the house settling, I whispered to myself. But then, as I turned to head back to the couch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the hallway, just outside my bedroom door, stood a man. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and his face was obscured by shadows. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring at me. My phone slipped from my hand, and the light went out as it hit the floor. I scrambled to pick it up, my fingers fumbling in the dark. When I turned the flashlight back on and pointed it toward the hallway, he was gone. I didn't wait to find out what was happening. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door, not even bothering to put on shoes. I drove straight to a friend's house and didn't come back until my roommates were home. To this day, I don't know how he got in or if he even did. The door was still locked and nothing was missing. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear footsteps in the hallway again. I live in an old house, the kind with creaky floors and doors that don't quite shut properly. Growing up, it was normal to hear strange noises. Pipes groaning, wind whistling through the gaps in the windows. My parents always brushed it off. It's just an old house, they'd say. But that night, I knew what I heard wasn't normal. It started around 11 p.m. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I was home alone. I've been scrolling through my phone in the living room, half watching a random sitcom. The house was quiet, aside from the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Then I heard it click. It was faint but distinct, like a door latch being lifted. I muted the TV and listened. For a moment, everything was still. Then came a sound that made my skin crawl, the long, slow creak of the basement door opening. Our basement door is heavy, with one of those old brass knobs you have to twist hard to open. There was no way it had opened on its own. I sat frozen on the couch, every muscle in my body tense. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I could find, an umbrella, and crept toward the kitchen where the basement door was. The light above the staircase was on, casting a dim glow onto the floor. The door was open, just slightly, enough to see the edge of the staircase leading down into darkness. I stared at it, my heart pounding. Slowly, I pushed the door open wider, the hinges groaning. Is someone there? I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring down into the black void of the basement. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But another part, the part that didn't want to be caught off guard, knew I had to check. With my phone flashlight in one hand and the umbrella in the other, I descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of mildew filled my nose. When I reached the bottom, I swept the light across the room. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, storage bins, and forgotten junk. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I saw it. In the far corner, just beyond the beam of my flashlight, there was a figure. It was small, hunched over, and shrouded in shadows. At first, I thought it was a pile of old clothes, but then it moved. I sucked in a breath, gripping the umbrella tighter. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even turn toward me. Instead, it shifted slightly, like it was crawling further into the corner. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. Slowly, I stepped back, keeping the flashlight trained on the corner. The figure stopped moving, and for a split second, I thought it might just be my imagination playing tricks on me. And then it stood up. It was tall, taller than any person should be, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured in shadow. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I shoved the umbrella through the handle to wedge it shut, then ran to my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. Every little noise made me jump. I kept expecting to hear footsteps on the stairs or see the basement door swing open again. The next morning, I called my parents and told them everything. They were skeptical, of course, but when my dad checked the basement, the door was still wedged shut, just like I'd left it. Nothing was out of place, but I know what I saw. And even now, years later, I can't go near the basement without feeling like something is watching me. I've always thought of myself as pretty fearless. I mean, what's there to be scared of when you live in a boring, small town where nothing ever happens? At least, that's what I used to believe. Until last Friday. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I begged them to let me stay home alone. I'm 17, practically an adult, and I had plans for a solo movie marathon, junk food, and no curfews. My mom was hesitant, but gave in after I promised to keep the doors locked and my phone on me at all times. Easy, right? The first night started out just as I planned. I ordered pizza, settled into the couch, and started watching some campy horror flicks. The kind where the characters make every dumb decision possible. I was halfway through my second movie when I heard it, a soft, barely audible knock at the back door. I paused the movie and stared at the dark kitchen where the sound had come from. My first thought was that it was the wind. It had been howling all night, and maybe a branch or something hit the door. I shrugged it off and pressed play, but then it happened again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. My heart thumped so hard it drowned out the movie. Who knocks at the back door? No one even goes to the backyard unless they know the house well. I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, straining to hear. Nothing. Just the wind, or so I told myself. Grabbing my phone, I walked cautiously toward the kitchen. The porch light was off, so I couldn't see anything through the glass door. My thumb hovered over the button to turn on the light, but something stopped me. What if whoever, or whatever, was out there was waiting for me to make myself visible? I backed away and locked myself in my bedroom upstairs. I texted my parents, but they didn't reply right away. It was almost midnight after all. I texted my best friend Claire instead, explaining what happened. She joked that it was probably a raccoon or my creepy neighbor Mr. Henson playing a prank. Her jokes didn't help. Then came the footsteps, faint, deliberate, and coming from downstairs. I froze in place, my blood turning to ice. I could hear them move from the kitchen toward the living room. Each step was slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be a raccoon. The house was dead silent except for the creak of floorboards. I clutched my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed. Me, someone's in the house. Claire, call the cops. Me, I don't know if I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm imagining it. Claire, are you seriously typing instead of calling? She was right. I needed to call, but as I reached for the phone app, I heard a sharp thud. Then another. It was coming up the stairs. I thought I was going to throw up. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone. I quickly dialed 911 and whispered into the receiver. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and lock myself in a room. I whispered that I already had. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I held my breath, praying the door would hold. The handle rattled, and I felt tears prick my eyes. The dispatcher was trying to calm me down, but I could barely hear her over the blood rushing in my ears. Suddenly, the handle stopped moving. The footsteps retreated, slow, heavy thuds back down the hallway. I waited, barely breathing, until I heard sirens wailing in the distance. When the police arrived, they found the back door unlocked and muddy footprints leading from the porch to the stairs. No one was inside the house, but they discovered something that still makes my skin crawl. The footprints didn't start at the porch. They started in the hallway outside the basement. I had locked every door that night, except the basement door. It started as a normal Thursday night. My parents were out late at a work event, leaving me alone to babysit my 6-year-old sister, Emma. She'd fallen asleep around 8:30, leaving me to enjoy the peace and quiet. I wasn't worried. Our neighborhood is quiet, safe, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. I settled into the living room with a bowl of popcorn, scrolling through my phone while some reality show played in the background. At some point, I glanced up at the large bay window that faced our front yard. I had pulled the curtains shut earlier, but a tiny gap in the fabric caught my eye. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a flicker of movement outside. I stared for a moment, holding my breath, but there was nothing. Probably just the wind swaying the bushes, I told myself, and went back to my phone. 15 minutes later, I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was irregular, almost hesitant, like someone was lightly drumming their fingers against glass. I muted the TV and listened, my pulse quickening. The tapping stopped, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. I walked to the front window, feeling foolish for being so jumpy, and peeked through the gap in the curtains. The street was empty, lit by a single, flickering streetlight. The front yard was still, the bushes unmoving in the cool night air. But something felt off. As I started to back away, I noticed the corner of our porch. The light there wasn't working. It hadn't been for weeks, but in the shadows, I could swear I saw a faint outline. It was like someone was crouched low, just out of sight. My chest tightened as adrenaline surged through me. I double-checked that the front door was locked before rushing back to the couch and grabbing my phone. I texted my mom, asking when they'd be home. No response. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was a stray animal or my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then came the sound of the back door creaking. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the house, it was unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I tiptoed toward the kitchen, every nerve in my body on edge. The back door was in the next room, separated by a small hallway. I could see the faint outline of moonlight spilling onto the floor, which shouldn't have been there. The door should have been closed. And it was open. I froze, trying to process. The door wasn't wide open, just cracked enough for someone or something to slip inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly crept forward, phone clutched in my hand. I was terrified, but I couldn't leave Emma alone upstairs. Then I saw it, a single muddy footprint on the tile floor. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. My mind raced. Someone had been outside, watching, waiting, and now they were inside. I bolted for the stairs, skipping 2 at a time, and locked myself and Emma in my parents' bedroom. She was still asleep, completely oblivious to the panic coursing through me. I dialed 911, whispering frantically to the operator. She asked if I could hear anything, and I strained to listen. At first, it was silent. Then, faintly, I heard the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs. "They're coming up," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The operator assured me the police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, stopping right outside the bedroom door. My hand hovered over the lock, even though I knew it wouldn't hold if they tried to force it. I held my breath, clutching Emma close as I stared at the door, waiting for it to rattle, or worse. But it didn't. The footsteps moved again, slowly this time, down the hall, toward the attic. I didn't move a muscle until I heard the faint whoop of sirens outside. Red and blue lights spilled through the bedroom window, and moments later, the front door burst open. I threw open the bedroom door and screamed for the officers, who searched the house. They didn't find anyone, but in the attic, they discovered a pile of cigarette butts, empty food wrappers, and a sleeping bag. Someone had been living there, watching us from the shadows, probably for weeks. To this day, I still can't look at the attic door without shuddering. It was supposed to be an easy night. My parents were at a friend's party, and they wouldn't be home until late. I had the house to myself, and I'd been looking forward to a long gaming session in peace. I had my snacks ready, a horror game loaded, and every light in the house off for maximum effect. Around 9:30, I paused the game to grab a soda from the kitchen. The house was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the floorboards. Nothing unusual. But as I passed the front door, I noticed something weird. The porch light was flickering. I frowned. That light had been fine earlier. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see a moth or a loose bulb. But all I saw was darkness. It was strange, but I brushed it off and headed back to my game. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffling noise. At first, I thought it was the game's audio, but when I muted the TV, the sound was still there. It was faint, like someone was walking on carpet. My stomach tightened as I realized it was coming from the hallway behind me. I turned slowly, my heart racing. The hallway was empty, the shadows long and deep. I stared for what felt like forever, waiting for some kind of movement, but nothing happened. "You're imagining things," I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh. Still, I grabbed the remote and turned on a few lights, just in case. I settled back into my chair and tried to focus on my game, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer. A steady, deliberate creaking, like someone was slowly stepping across the floor. I paused the game and sat frozen, listening. It was definitely coming from the hallway. My heart was hammering now. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I stood up, my palms sweating, and grabbed a nearby lamp for a weapon. Slowly, I crept toward the hallway. The sound stopped the moment I reached the edge of the room. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit and eerily silent. My bedroom door was closed, just as I'd left it. The bathroom door was cracked open, but it was empty. I inched forward, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. When I reached my bedroom, I pushed the door open with the lamp and flipped on the light. Nothing. The room was exactly how I'd left it. Bed unmade, clothes on the floor, nothing out of place. I let out a shaky breath and laughed at myself. "You're losing it," I said aloud. I went back to the living room, telling myself it was just the house settling or my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see what? I didn't even know. Around 10:30, I heard the front door. I froze. The door was locked. I knew I'd locked it, but now it sounded like it was slowly creaking open. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and stood up, gripping the lamp tightly in my other hand. The sound stopped. I tiptoed toward the entryway, every muscle in my body tense. The door was closed, the deadbolt still in place. But as I turned back toward the living room, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The hallway light was off. I hadn't turned it off. My hands were trembling as I backed away, my phone already dialing 911. The dispatcher's calm voice filled my ear as I tried to explain what was happening. She told me to stay on the line and get somewhere safe. I barely heard her over the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. They were louder now, moving steadily toward me. "I think they're in the house," I whispered. The dispatcher told me to leave if I could, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the hallway. A shadow moved. It was slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. A tall, humanoid figure emerging from the darkness. I screamed and bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock as the dispatcher tried to keep me calm. Just as I threw the door open, I glanced back. The hallway was empty. When the police arrived a few minutes later, they searched the entire house. All the doors and windows were locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. But here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. In the hallway, they found a set of footprints. Bare, wet footprints that stopped right outside my bedroom door. Whoever, or whatever, had been there was gone, and I still have no idea how they got in. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. I love scary movies, haunted houses, ghost stories, you name it. But what happened to me last summer made me question everything I thought I knew about fear. It was a Saturday night, and my parents had gone out of town for a wedding. I stayed behind to watch the house because, honestly, the idea of sitting through a long ceremony and awkward family small talk didn't appeal to me. I was 18, responsible, and more than capable of handling myself. The night started out fine. I made a big plate of nachos curled up on the couch and threw on one of my favorite horror movies. It was almost midnight when I started to feel a little uneasy. At first, it was subtle, like the way the house seemed quieter than usual. I shrugged it off as my imagination and kept watching the movie. But then I noticed a sound. It was faint, barely audible, but definitely there. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I paused the movie and sat perfectly still listening. The sound was coming from upstairs. I rolled my eyes at myself. It's probably just the pipes. Our house was old, and it made all kinds of noises when the temperature changed. I turned the movie back on and tried to ignore it, but the tapping didn't stop. It was steady, deliberate, and getting louder. By now, my heart was racing, and every logical explanation I could think of, pipes, creaky floorboards, even a squirrel on the roof, started to feel less and less likely. I grabbed my phone and walked cautiously to the foot of the stairs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response, just the tapping. I debated calling my parents, but I didn't want to seem like a scared little kid. Instead, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find for protection, a broom, and started up the stairs. The sound was coming from the guest bedroom, a room we hardly ever used. As I got closer, I realized the tapping wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, like someone was lightly drumming their fingers against the wall. My throat felt dry as I reached the door. It was slightly ajar, and the tapping stopped the moment I touched the handle. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and go back downstairs. But I couldn't let it go. I had to know. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I stood there for a moment, confused and a little embarrassed. Maybe I'd imagined it. Then I saw it. On the far wall, just above the headboard of the bed, was a smear. It was dark, shiny, and unmistakably fresh. Blood. My stomach flipped, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I bolted out of the room, slammed the door shut, and ran downstairs. I called my best friend, Taylor, and told her what happened. She tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a prank or a bad joke from one of the neighborhood kids. "Check the locks," she said. "Make sure no one's inside." I did as she suggested, walking through the house with trembling hands. Every door and window was locked tight. I even checked the basement, though I hated going down there. When I finally sat back down on the couch, I felt a little better. Maybe Taylor was right. Maybe it was just some stupid prank. But then the tapping started again. This time, it was coming from the living room wall, right behind the couch. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to hear. There was a faint noise, so faint I almost missed it. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was whispering, low, guttural, and just barely audible, like someone was speaking directly into the wall. I stumbled back, my breathing shallow. "This isn't funny," I yelled, but the whispers continued. Panicking, I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house. I sat in my car, shaking, and called the police. I told them someone had broken into my house and was hiding inside. When the officers arrived, they searched every inch of the house. They didn't find anyone, but they couldn't explain the blood smear or the noises I'd heard. One of them, an older guy with a kind face, pulled me aside. "You know the history of this house?" he asked. I shook my head. He hesitated, then said, "There was an incident here about 20 years ago. A woman went missing. Her husband claimed she ran off, but there were rumors. People said she was murdered and hidden somewhere in the house." I stared at him, my mouth dry. You think that's what I heard?" He didn't answer, just gave me a long, pitying look. That night, I stayed at Taylor's place. I didn't sleep. A week later, my parents had the guest bedroom wall repaired. The contractor called them into the room to show them something. Inside the wall, they found a small compartment, sealed off with wooden planks. And inside the compartment, they found bones. I've never stepped foot in that house again. I still can't explain what happened that night. I've told myself 100 different versions of the story, each one slightly less terrifying than the truth, but none of them make sense. Maybe it's better that way. It was a quiet evening, just me in the house. My parents were out celebrating their anniversary, and I had declined the invitation to join them. At 19, I valued my independence, and honestly, the thought of spending the night in my pajamas watching trashy TV felt far more appealing than sitting through a fancy dinner. The house felt peaceful at first. The sun dipped below the horizon as I flipped through channels, settling on a crime show. I stretched out on the couch, the soft glow of the TV washing over the living room. Then, around 9:30, the lights flickered. I glanced up at the ceiling, frowning. Power outages weren't unusual in our old neighborhood, but this was different. The flicker wasn't erratic. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was dimming the lights just enough to catch my attention. I reached for my phone to check for updates from the power company, but stopped when the flickering lights steadied again. Shrugging it off as a weird glitch, I went back to my show. Not 10 minutes later, the lights flickered again. This time, it wasn't just the living room. I could see the faint glow of the kitchen light beyond the doorway, and it too was dimming in and out. A chill crawled up my spine. I paused the TV and stood up, my bare feet pressing into the cool hardwood floor. "Hello," I called, though I wasn't sure why. The word echoed back at me, swallowed by the silence of the house. I stepped into the kitchen, the lights above flickering more erratically now. It was disorienting, making the shadows seem like they were shifting on their own. I glanced out the window over the sink. The street lights were steady. Whatever was happening wasn't affecting the whole neighborhood, just my house. I grabbed my phone and texted my dad. "Me, hey, the lights keep flickering. Probably nothing, but it's weird. Dad, might be the circuit breaker. I'll check it tomorrow. Stay safe." I sighed. Of course, it was nothing. I told myself to relax and headed back to the couch. But as I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner or glanced out a window, I half expected to see someone staring back at me. At 10:15, the lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back. The house plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the pale blue light of the TV. I froze. My pulse quickened as I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, and I swung it around the room. Nothing, just my familiar living room, empty and still. Then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard a sound. It was faint like a soft thump, followed by a dragging noise. My stomach twisted. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, even though I knew they weren't home. Silence. The dragging sound came again, louder this time, as if it was moving closer to the stairs. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling or something falling over in my parents' room, but deep down, I didn't believe that. My hands shook as I made my way to the staircase, gripping the railing tightly. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I aimed it up the stairs. The top was shrouded in darkness, the faint outline of the hallway barely visible. "Hello!" I called again, my voice cracking. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I started to convince myself it was all in my head, I heard it, whispering. It was low and indistinct, like several voices speaking at once. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The whispers grew louder, though I still couldn't make out what they were saying. It was coming from my parents' room at the end of the hall. I don't know what possessed me to keep going, but I forced myself up the stairs, every step feeling like a mile. The whispers stopped the moment I reached the top. The door to my parents' room was open just a crack, and I could see a faint glow spilling out. It wasn't the overhead light or a lamp. It was strange, pulsating, almost like the light was alive. I approached the door slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's in there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I pushed the door open, and the glow vanished. The room was empty. I stood there, panting, my flashlight scanning every corner. The bed was untouched, the curtains still drawn. But on the floor, near the dresser, was something that made my blood run cold. A single handprint. It was smudged into the carpet, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't wet or muddy, but it shimmered slightly in the beam of my flashlight. Before I could process what I was seeing, the door to the hallway slammed shut behind me. I screamed, spinning around and yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers started again, louder now, surrounding me. I backed away, pressing myself against the dresser. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but deafening silence. Then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and indistinct. It was like a shadow, but darker, with no discernible face, just empty blackness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stretched one long, shadowy limb toward me. I shut my eyes, bracing for I don't even know what. But then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The door swung open, and the lights came back on. I bolted out of the house, not stopping until I reached the driveway. My parents came home an hour later to find me sitting in the car, shaking uncontrollably. They didn't believe me, of course. They said I must have fallen asleep and had a bad dream. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I still hear the whispers. Last month, I spent a Saturday night alone at home, and it's a night I'll never forget. My parents were at a wedding 3 towns over, and my little brother was at a sleepover. I'd been looking forward to a quiet night in, the kind where I could order greasy takeout, watch bad reality shows, and scroll through my phone without interruptions. The evening started off just like I planned. I had my Chinese food spread out on the coffee table, an episode of Survivor playing in the background, and my feet kicked up on the couch. Everything was perfect, until the mirror cracked. It was a loud, sharp sound like ice breaking under pressure. I jumped, nearly spilling my drink, and looked around. The mirrors in the house weren't exactly new. My mom loved decorating with antique finds, but I'd never heard anything like that before. I wandered into the hallway, where the largest mirror in the house hung. Sure enough, a thin crack ran down the center of it, splitting my reflection in two. "That's weird," I muttered to myself. The mirror had been fine earlier. I touched the glass lightly, feeling the jagged ridge of the crack. It wasn't a huge deal, I figured. Old mirrors get brittle. Stuff like this happens. I went back to the couch, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But as the hours went by, that feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. It started with the noises. I was halfway through another episode when I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the TV, but when I muted the volume, the tapping continued. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like knuckles rapping lightly against wood. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood up and looked around. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking slightly. No response. I walked cautiously to the front door, checking the locks. Everything was secure. I went to the windows, same thing, but as I was double-checking the back door, I saw it. The hallway mirror. The crack was larger now, stretching from the top of the glass to the bottom. And my reflection, it wasn't moving the way it should. I froze. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. The reflection stared back at me, perfectly still, even as I stepped closer. "Okay, this is officially creepy," I whispered. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire house plunged into darkness for a few seconds before they snapped back on. When the lights returned, the mirror was empty. No reflection, just the cracked surface staring back at me. I backed away, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I grabbed my phone and tried to call my mom, but the call wouldn't go through. I had full bars, but all I got was static. Then, the mirror started to drip. It was slow at first, dark, viscous drops pooling at the base of the frame. It looked like ink or oil, but it smelled metallic like rust. Blood. I bolted back into the living room, heart racing. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter and sat on the couch, clutching my phone in the other hand. That's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. The hallway mirror wasn't empty anymore. There was a figure standing in the glass, a tall, shadowy silhouette with broad shoulders and unnaturally long arms. It wasn't me, and it wasn't my reflection. It was him. I stared, paralyzed, as the figure stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. His head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised one long finger and tapped the inside of the glass. Tap, tap, tap. My blood turned to ice. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, he was gone. But the tapping continued. It was coming from behind me now. I whipped around, the knife trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. The tapping grew louder, faster, as if it were coming from every surface in the house. The walls, the windows, the mirrors. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Too still. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making you feel like you're being watched. I turned back toward the hallway mirror. He was there again, but this time, he wasn't alone. There were others. Dozens of shadowy figures crowded into the glass, their faces obscured, their bodies shifting and writhing as if trapped beneath the surface. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table. The figures began pounding on the glass, their movements frantic and violent. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 fists hammering against the door. The crack in the mirror widened, spreading like a spiderweb. And then it shattered. Glass exploded outward, sending shards flying across the room. I screamed, covering my face as the air grew cold, freezing cold. When I opened my eyes, the figures were gone. The mirror was gone too, reduced to a pile of broken glass on the floor. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning and the house was eerily quiet. The police didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They said it must have been a break-in or a prank gone wrong. My parents thought I was overtired, my imagination running wild. But I know what I saw, and every time I pass by a mirror now, I can't help but glance over my shoulder. Because sometimes, if the light hits just right, I still see him.